Hey, welcome back to the podcast. I'm super excited today. I've got my good buddy David Barr on the program, and we are talking about his new arm training book, which will have a link to it down below where you can pick it up. I've known Dave for, many years now, and it's always great to talk with him. I always learn new stuff. And while it is an arm training book, which is great, he also has a lot of other information there about how to set up your training in a better fashion, different aspects of your central nervous system, and just the nervous system overall, and how to get better training effects. Dave was nice enough to have a quote from me in the book, but I don't have any other disclosures for it. I don't make any money if you pick up the book or not, but it is really good, and I've enjoyed it, and I'm super excited to get him on the program here today and to talk more about that and anything else to enhance your performance in the gym and add more muscle. As always, the podcast is brought to you by the Flex Diet Certification. So if you're looking for a way to maximize your nutrition and recovery, to add more muscle, increase your performance, and improve your body composition, all without destroying your health, check out the Flex Diet Certification. Go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com, and there'll be a way to get on the wait list in the upper hand corner there. Click on that. That will put you onto the daily newsletter. You get all sorts of free information on that topic, and you'll also be the first to be notified once the Flex Diet Cert opens again. So go to flexdiet.com, sign up to the waitlist there, and here's our conversation with the one and only David Barr. Hey, what's going on? Welcome to the Flex Diet Podcast, and today we're here with my good buddy David Barr. Say hello, sir.
Hey, that's me.
That's you. You're on. We're live, or somewhat live, whatever.
Nice.
How are you doing?
I am doing fantastic. Very excited to talk about my new book and the massive implications, which are related to the title, which is Massive Muscular Arms, published by Human Kinetics. And I really think that you're going to like, especially one of the contributors who talked about metabolic flexibility, Dr. Martinez.
How'd that a-hole get in the book?
Yeah, I don't know.
But yeah, I got a copy of the book here, so thank you to them for sending it. And I thought it turned out really good. I thought the pictures and everything were good, like how it was listed. You've got I like the equipment setup, execution, and then the coaching tips on it. So not only do you got pictures, but you've got all sorts of how to execute everything too. Which I think is super useful sometimes, especially with books. It can be harder to convey how to do an exercise in the version that the author wants them to do it. I think a lot of stuff has gone to video, but I'm still one of those weird kind of old school people where I like having books. I like that it's offline. I can sit down on my couch and read. I'm not distracted by 800 things online. So I still am one of those weirdos, probably like yourself, judging by the books in your background, that I think books still serve a very good purpose for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's cool to have, everything available online, and, you have a PDF, you can do what you want with it, but there's something to be said for, holding a physical copy of a book in your hands.
Yeah. And the other part too, I've been on this thing lately where for the price of books, they're still so insanely cheap for the amount of time and effort and history and experience that someone puts into it. And the fact that I can pick up, your book for what is it, like $25 or something like that, and consume the content and basically get almost a download of your brain on a specific topic, to me is it's still mind-blowing.
I like that. And that's actually a good point, specifically with where I was going with my book, because I've been involved in strength and conditioning for over 20 years now. Started off back in the day, University of Waterloo, Dr. Stu McGill was one of my earliest mentors in the field. And writing this book, taking those 20 plus years in the industry and then almost 30 years of training myself now really helped me reflect on the number of people who have influenced me in so many different ways. So it was cool to look back, but also really I started to appreciate all the people who were involved and what they taught me, whether or not they meant to teach me something specific. People have been very generous with their time and their patience, and I really wanted to start offering gratitude and acknowledging that. So rather than just giving, some standard meathead system that is proprietary or something I claim to have developed, I really integrate dozens of experts throughout the decades to really give a synthesis of what I think is the best information and something that's usable for everyone.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think on one hand, there's always a place for something that is original, but at this phase of the game, there's not really going to be that much stuff that's original. And if it's original, doesn't mean that it's better than what we did before. It may be completely utter trash. Just because it's new and novel doesn't mean it's the best thing ever. Shake weights, and there's all sorts of stuff we can think of that's novel, that's just completely worthless trash. So I think being able to, the next level down would be being able to synthesize stuff, I think is a very, very useful skill that unfortunately I get nervous is disappearing. Hopefully none of my students are listening to this, but
nice.
One of the things I try to at least instill in them is like, you're going to have access to almost any type of information you want now, especially with the internet, but can you take that and, like you did, systematically apply it to solve a problem? And I think that is a unique skill set that is then useful, because to the consumer, like I said, I can pick up the book and go, wow, here's a download of Dave Barr's brain for the last 30 years for $25. Cool. And he took all these other sources and put it together, and I can then take it and go to the gym and go, oh, cool, I can actually apply this now to, not just arms, but the ideas to the rest of your body. So I still think that's an extremely useful skill that is not taught as much as it should be.
I really like the way you articulated that. And there's almost a tacit or unspoken warning when it comes to our industry, because the fitness industry is just rife with hyperbole. I mean, it's infamous for nonsense.
Yes.
So there are just so many historical examples where people are trying to build their brand, and they create their system, and they've got the one way to train. They got the new best way, and it's the only way, and just that type of dogma is it's absurd. It appeals to a lot of people. It appealed to me when I first started training, Mike Mentzer, heavy duty style back in the day. And I will say it is, if you hear somebody saying that they have the one true way, I mean, run to the hills, run for your lives, because there is no single way. So my goal is to give a variety of options. Really, I can give people a program if they want, which I'm happy to do. We have to start somewhere. But really, one of the keys to the book is personalization. What is going to be best for you? And I think in the 21st century, we are just begging for this type of training style. So I do it not only with programming, show you how, I walk through how to develop a personalized program, and there's guidance there all the way. So I don't, throw you to the wolves or anything, but, getting more reductive all the way down to your own personal anatomy. And that's where I think arm training is especially helpful, because the personalized anatomy with our arms, I had no idea until I really dove into the research on this book. I had no idea how personalized it was. So I really wanted to give people the opportunity to custom tailor not just their workouts and their programming, but also the actual individual exercises themselves.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how would you go about giving, maybe not to give away all your secrets in the book, but what would be some examples of that? Because I think even for myself listening, I'm like, I don't know, it's just arm training. Like, how different is it? But then I'm like, of course it has to be different, right? You've got different insertion points, you've got different exercises, you've got, muscles like the biceps that are biarticulate that cross, two joints, and you've got grip training on top of that. And so I'm like, oh yeah, that's probably more complicated than just do some curls.
Yeah, exactly. You're exactly right. Now, I didn't appreciate this. I mean, after training for nearly 30 years, I did not appreciate how complicated the anatomy of the arms actually was, and then the degree that we can affect change with custom tailored programming and exercises. So I'll give you 3 examples across 3 different dimensions for how you can personalize this. And we'll start off super reductive, and then we'll build all the way up. So turns out we in the scientific world, as you know, Mike, we don't fully understand how muscle growth occurs. But the latest theory is that there are 3 different types of muscle growth. And the idea is that by targeting each of them individually, we can affect the greatest change, get the biggest collective increase in muscle growth. So what I want to do is I simplify this down, taking it from 3 theoretical types of hypertrophy or growth. I narrow it down to just 2, which is basically a metabolic stress and a mechanical stress. So again, we want to target both of those to get the biggest bang for our buck. So I show how to do that. Our standard regular gravity-based resistance training is a blend of both. It's actually more metabolic than it is structural, but it is a compromise. And I'm not in any way suggesting we throw out regular training. It's our bread and butter. I think it always will be. But 21st century, like, there's new things that we can also apply. So I show how to tap into not only just the metabolic stimulus for growth, but also the mechanical stimulus for growth. And that's just one way of very precisely targeting your preferences and goals. The second way is probably a little easier for us to understand. It's just our own personalized anatomy. And you're right. I wrote the book and I indicated that the biceps, for example, are a biarticular muscle. How about this? What if they are effectively a triarticular muscle?
Ooh, now it's
How
blow my mind.
crazy is that? I mean, I didn't want to overcomplicate the book, so I didn't talk about that specifically. But really, the idea is that the biceps control movement across 3 joints, even though they don't actually cross 3 joints. So shoulder, elbow, and wrist.
Yep.
So this is just, it opens up so many opportunities for changing the way in which we contract the muscle and ultimately provide that stimulus for strength and growth. So that alone is just a huge upgrade in terms of our thinking. That I think, once we get smart people like yourself involved, we can really have a forward-thinking conversation about how to develop new exercises and techniques to do that. And I go through some of those. Really simply, I think that the simplest one is relates to the carrying angle of your elbow. And if you look down, straighten your arms below you, Mike, you can help me articulate this. But if you look down at your elbow, you'll notice that your arm bone, your humerus, it can be vertical, but your elbow actually kinks out to the side a little bit. So your forearms are not directly in line with your arm. And that angle is called carrying angle. And the idea is that, we can clear our hips when we're running. Don't have to know the details, but the idea is that different people have different magnitudes of carrying angle. Some people have very large, often women actually have a greater carrying angle than men, but this can impact how you perform your arm movements, every single arm movement. So if you look at your carrying angle, make it as big as possible with your arms straight. Now imagine you're picking up a bar to do biceps curls. Now curl this imaginary bar up so you're performing just a regular biceps curl. Now look at where your forearm is relative to your arm, to your humerus. It is now in line. So we have what's called a grip delta, or a change in the width, the spacing between our hands, between the bottom of a curl and the top of a curl, for example. Now, if we're using a barbell, we can't change that, right? We can't change that during the rep. We're locked in. But it is important to consider, not only if you are used to grabbing a barbell in a very specific way, which we probably all are, but also if you have any kind of elbow pain, adjusting your grip according to typically the top position is going to potentially help mitigate that pain. And it's personalized, using your own personalized anatomy to change your grip to give you the biggest bang for your buck.
Very cool. And so would that be an argument for the use of dumbbells to allow that a little bit more movement through space to be less restricted then? So an easy thing I've told trainers is like, hey, if your barbell exercises start causing pain, just substitute them for dumbbell exercises and see what happens. And a lot of times, like, oh my God, my pain went away. I was doing barbell bench press and now I'm doing dumbbell bench press and it doesn't hurt. Or I did barbell bicep curls and it hurt. And now I use dumbbells and it doesn't hurt. Right now, this is more of the context of being an online trainer where I'm not necessarily being able to look at your technique. Yes, if you're a competitive bench presser, you're probably going to have to use a straight bar. And so there's some restrictions with that. But is that kind of a similar along that vein, allowing just more range of motion, for lack of a better word, to account for carrying angles and differences?
I think that's actually an awesome point. I don't go as far as offering a prescription, so do one versus the other. It's more about let's start with the awareness and then try this out and then see how it works for you.
Got it.
Because I have had people who have had a profound difference by changing up their grip. Because again, if we think that grabbing the bar on the knurling, wherever that happens to be, if that's the way to grab a bar, because I read that there's, here's how your grip needs to be. It doesn't work for everybody, especially all the time. So just mix it up, and not only for pain, but muscle contraction. How does it feel to contract the muscle? And that's a really big emphasis in the book, is learning how to contract the muscle maximally. And that's basically, again, to get bigger gains rather than just, our traditional throwing around loads, which I've certainly never done before. But
Me neither.
Of course yeah, right. So it's more about appreciating the idea that we are trying to stimulate growth rather than we are just trying to move heavier loads. And it takes a while to really let that sink in. Really helps our ego take a back seat, especially if we are focused. Okay, yes, I am going to use a lighter weight. I'm going to use better form, and I am going to focus on my muscle contraction. And that is ultimately going to give me bigger gains. And if you don't want bigger gains, then that's absolutely cool. You do whatever you want to do. But the key is, if you are looking for bigger gains, you really need to tap into your anabolic stimulus that you get from training. So I really try to emphasize that. It doesn't mean you go light all the time. Like, there's a strength training phase for hypertrophy as well within the book. But the idea is, again, focusing on the stimulus, which helps remove our ego from the equation.
Got it. I have lots of follow-up questions. So going back to the biceps as a mover of three things, are you thinking about shoulder movement across the elbow, and then supination? Like, so hold the cup of soup versus pronation, pat the dog. Is that what you're thinking of in terms of the three movements?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, the biceps do all three. And again, you're right. I mean, they're a biarticular muscle. They only cross two joints, the shoulder and the elbow, but they directly impact what happens at our wrist. And what we do at our wrist impacts level of biceps activation. So the way I say is it's practically or effectively tri-articular. So just to, again, raise that awareness of what we're trying to do. If we're trying to maximally stimulate a muscle for growth or even strength eventually, then we need to be aware of all the different opportunities we have to stimulate as many fibers as possible.
Yeah, an example I've told people on that is imagine what you feel in your bicep doing a reverse curl. So palms down versus palms up, right? Pretty much everyone's going to be like, yeah, I feel my biceps a lot more when I'm palms up, right? Because that's part of the function of the biceps. That's part of what it does in life. So,
yeah, exactly. And there's a great way to play with this. I recommend, I mean, again, I don't want to be a dead horse, but I have been training for nearly 30 years. And what I love about this stuff is I am just constantly learning new things about it as much as I've obsessed over it. So a great example, no joke, about 2.5 hours ago, I was in the gym doing biceps, of course, but just playing with something. And this is something I'd recommend doing to get an incredible understanding of the differences in muscle contraction. Take a relatively light dumbbell, do a concentration curl. So you are leaning over, your elbow and your arm and shoulder, therefore, are supported by your leg. So you have just incredible stability. And just quick sidebar, I appreciate that they used to be a punchline. Okay, concentration curls used to be a punchline, but now that we understand a little more, they're more of the thinking man's curl or thinking person's curl. Okay, because we really get to tap into every fiber when we are that focused and that stable. So the key is, and this goes back to some of the anatomical variations and opportunities that we have, use what is called a pinky grip. So you are grabbing the dumbbell, the light dumbbell, with the pinky side of your hand right up against the dumbbell. So you're not gripping in the middle, you are gripping on the pinky side of your hand. Okay. And this is going to basically give you a little forced supination. So it's going to really help you turn your palm upward. Now you do your set like that. You're not turning your palm up as you come up to peak contraction. You are maintaining maximal supination throughout. Then do a follow-up set once you've had appropriate rest, but use an index and thumb grip. So instead of gripping it in the middle or at the end, the pinky, you are moving your thumb and your index finger up against the plate. And so it's basically the opposite end. And this is going to make you work very hard to supinate. And again, you're not just supinating at the end, you're not twisting your wrist as you contract. You are trying to maintain maximal supination throughout the entire movement. And you will feel a huge difference between those two. And that basically gives you a great indication of what the biceps are doing, what other arm muscles are doing throughout the movement when you exaggerate the supination or you have to really work hard to get the supination. So that's just one long-winded example, but I just did it and I'm kind of excited about it. So I have to share because I think it's really cool.
That's super cool. Man, that's something that's super practical too, that people can, go out and apply right away. One thing I've done is some people I've noticed are missing pronation supination, right? So that's a thing they're missing. And so if you want to go to the other extreme and emphasize that, take like a sledgehammer or like a club bell and put that like crosswise in your hand. And then you can either adjust the lever arm and do curls with it. So you even like a 10-pound club, if you've got most of the weight out here, right? Again, it's forcing you into that position. So you've got a heavy load more on pronation supination and less on the bicep if that was your goal. Or you can use the same thing and then do pronation supination with that movement, right? So it's basically the inverse of what you were doing. Again, depending upon what people are doing and for what particular goal. But what I like is it's the same principle, right? So once you understand the principle of why you're actually doing it, then you can adjust it to, different needs. So if I wanted to emphasize supination or pronation, I could go that way. If I want to emphasize more bicep function, I can go the other way.
Nice. Yeah, I love that. And there is some preliminary research that the biceps the two heads of the biceps might actually differ in terms of the amount of recruitment you get from each based on the amount of supination. So for example, the short head of the biceps might actually be more involved in supination. So that's where, again, huge opportunity to really get your head inside of your own muscle to optimize your gains.
Awesome. And I was talking, I think it was Eric Helms about this too. Do you think that muscle growth hypertrophy just in general is this weird sort of almost side effect, right? Because we know like training for strength, we kind of know what you have to do, right? It's primarily a SAID principle, specific adaptation to impose demand. If I want to lift a heavier bench press, at some point, doing reps over, probably 90% of my 1RM, I'm probably going to need to do that, especially after assuming I'm not just like somebody new to training. And I think, there is a role for having more muscle tissue. You have a bigger potential to move more load. But at the end of the day, you can't get around the fact that you're going to have to lift heavy if you want to significantly get stronger. But it seems like for hypertrophy, you could do heavy loads and just do a shit ton of volume. Maybe your joints won't last, but you could potentially do that. You could do as light as 30% of load, in some research. Whether that's blood flow restriction or not is debatable, but it just seems like there's this really wide range of training parameters to try to get at hypertrophy. And on top of that, the variability to programs, even the same program from one person to the next, at least to me, and I'd be interested in your opinion, seems to be much higher variability than there is for, say, strength training.
Nice. Yeah, that is, wow, that is a fantastic concept. And I guess starting off, cool that you mentioned Dr. Eric Helms. He's also somebody I mentioned in the book.
Yeah.
Because he did a lot of the research on the programming aspect, which is the third type of personalization, which we can get to in a second. But yeah, you are exactly right. And I think what you're saying, because of the variability, this is why I tried to emphasize what I call precision micro-targeting for the different aspects of hypertrophy. Because so you do BFR, you do the light load, probably going to get a much greater metabolic stimulus and not so much the structural stimulus. Now, you are going to get some structural. BFR sucks, by the way. It is
so blood flow restriction. You want to explain what that is briefly if people are like, what are these people talking about?
Yeah, thank you. So BFR, blood flow restriction, you want to cut off the blood supply leaving the muscle when you are performing resistance exercise. So you can use a much lighter load, but still get a massive metabolic stimulus for growth. And it's great for people who, say, older individuals, people who have injuries, etc. There is a broad application, and I'm not sure that it's, I don't know, Mike, I would actually value your input on this, because there seems to be a, how can I say, it seems to be the Wild West in terms of how people are practically applying BFR training, where there seems to be actual very specific protocols to do it. So for example, the tightness of the cuff that you put around your arm, for example, your upper arm by your shoulder, or across your shoulder, it's individualized, the tightness, and you can't really go by feel at first, because it has to be tight enough to let blood flow in, but tight enough to not let blood flow out, which we can't feel that. So until we really establish that feeling, which I don't know if we can, people may be shooting themselves in the foot doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of gone with Jeremy Lenecky's published a whole bunch of stuff on this, looking at what they call practical blood flow restriction. And I agree that it just takes you kind of some time playing around with it. And I'm a cheap bastard, so I just have like the old school knee wraps that I've cut in half if I'm doing arm stuff, or I'll leave the knee wraps and if I do leg stuff. And I played around with it for years. I initially learned it 2014 from Jeremy. Um, when you get it right, like it's painful, but just because of the amount of blood flow in the area, which, for the style of training I'm used to, I'm not really used to that. So my thought is, if I get people to just don't apply it too tight, we don't want arterial occlude, right? We don't want to occlude blood flow coming in. You don't really know where that point is without a direct measurement. There's different ways of possibly measuring it, but either way, you would need a direct measurement, which is one, a pain in the ass to do. Two, is also expensive, depending on what you pick. So I tell people just put it on, and if you guess too light, maybe it's not having as much effect as you want. But there's even some literature I'm sure you've seen too that shows maybe the blood flow restriction isn't having as much of a benefit as what we thought, in terms of keeping the loads the same. So I figure worst case scenario, usually I'm programming it for an accessory thing like biceps is a good example. And they're still doing higher rep loads that they wouldn't have been doing anyway, which we know there's probably going to be some benefit to that, right? So a lot of times I'll do which I got from Jeremy, like the 30, 15, 15, 15 protocol. Take a load you can hit 30 reps with, and then take another, I do a lot of military press and bicep curls, right? Because I can use about the same weight. I don't have to change anything. And then once you hit 30 reps in your first set, then drop down and do 15 reps. So I figure, worst case, if they didn't hit the, venous occlusion type part right on the blood flow wrap, they can do it again next time and play around with just a little bit tighter. But they're still probably getting some mechanical tension, probably a lot of, metabolic stimulus by doing it anyway. And I've programmed that usually in addition to the other work that they're doing. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I think they'll get a benefit even if they don't hit the blood flow restriction part, perfectly dead nuts on all the time.
Awesome. Yeah, very, very well said. I like that. And I don't know what your experience is with clients, but unless somebody's super hardcore, I find
most people hate it if it's general population.
Yes.
I don't even like it, to be honest.
Yeah, it gets kind of nasty.
Yeah, especially when you're just not used to it, right? I mean, I've been trying to add a little bit more of that training in, and it's just, I don't know, maybe it's the older I get, the more I realize how hyper specialized I get. So for example, I did tricep press downs the other day. And so I've been playing with, rep ranges of, 20 to 30 reps. It's such a short stroke, movement, your time isn't taking very long. And the first time doing just, 30 reps close to failure on that, I'm like, I forgot how weird that, hydrogen ions, the acidity, all that stuff feels just because I'm not used to training like that. So for some people, they're more used to that. And I was like, oh yeah, I forgot how much this kind of sucks. Where some people really like that, so it's an individual thing too.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah, and I think this is a great indicator of the type of precision that we can apply to hypertrophy training, because everything you just talked about, the hydrogen ions, the acidity, that's a potent stimulus for muscle growth. Theoretically, what we refer to as the metabolic stimulus for hypertrophy. It's a buildup of metabolic byproducts like acid, and potentially a minor depletion of energy, but overwhelmingly we tend to shut down, we tend to fatigue because of the buildup of stuff, of what's called metabolites, rather than a lack of energy per se. So that's, again, the metabolic stimulus. And the other version of that, which could be subdivided into two components, is basically what I refer to as just a mechanical stimulus, a mechanical tension. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier, a lot of novelty, not necessarily great. We have a lot that we can draw from already, pre-existing literature and practice, and so many people with fantastic experience. But I did also want to go into the more novel realm because right now I think that we're using about a third of our maximum strength when we're training, even when we're doing heavier loads. And I appreciate that sounds like hyperbole. There's nothing metaphysical. Like, I'm not saying you're going to get 200% more strength by tapping a hidden light inside of you, right? Nothing like that. It's just physics and physiology.
So explain that. So how, if we're only using a third, what would be something we can do to increase that?
Yeah, so this is something I go into detail about in the book, because it comes back to a fundamental misunderstanding that we have about strength training. And this is not, I'm not pointing fingers, it's not criticism. I think this is our biggest opportunity for gains. I've never seen anything this massive when it comes to an opportunity to change the way we look at training. I think at barbells, dumbbells, still going to be our bread and butter. We're not getting rid of that. But what if we find something new? What if there's a different way to look at it? And it comes back to a very commonly misunderstood concept called the force velocity curve. And I screwed this up back in 2003, very publicly for T Nation. And I published the idea that the force velocity curve shows that when we do very slow eccentric or negative movements, we're exerting more force. And turns out this is a common misunderstanding. In fact, when I worked for the NSCA, National Strength and Conditioning Association, I had the opportunity to kind of quiz, we'll say, over 50 strength coaches and personal trainers. And I found that more than 96% of them got this fundamental concept wrong, just as I did. Now, consider that this is impacting every single rep that we do. If we're misunderstanding this, that's a huge opportunity for improvement. So you can take the quiz yourself, and we'll say it's a two-part quiz. Question number one, are we stronger during the positive or concentric contraction or the eccentric negative part of the contraction? And everybody gets this right. We are stronger eccentrically. We know this. Second part, when we are training, do we exert more force on the concentric or the eccentric? Now, before you answer, let's just do a quick walkthrough. So let's say it's Monday and you manage to queue up and get your bench press to do your weekly sets. And you're starting off with a nice light load, 100 pounds total on the bar. And you want to do this experiment starting off at your chest. Okay, you're supporting the load with your musculature, 100 pounds pulling down on you, bar's not moving yet. How much force are you exerting? Well, if the bar's not moving, it's got to be 100 pounds, right? So equal resistance. This is what's called isometric contraction. Now you want to press the bar up away from you, perform that concentric. How much force do you have to exert? Well, 101 pounds, anything over the 100 pounds that's pulling down on you. You press the bar up. Now you're at the top, you're at lockout. 100 pounds pulling down on you, bar's not moving. How much force are you exerting? Once again, 100 pounds, because it's isometric contraction. Now, this is where it gets sexy. We are going to perform the eccentric, the negative, get back down to our chest. And because we are stronger eccentrically, we are going to exert more force. But wait, we're already at lockout. How do we exert more force? And if we could exert more force, the bar would go up, not down. So in order to perform that negative, to get the bar down to our chest, we have to exert less force. So this is what I refer to as the eccentric paradox. We are much stronger eccentrically, and yet we exert less force. And we do it on every single rep. Now, this has massive implications for muscle strength, muscle growth, and by extension, fat loss. So if we could play with this idea, I mean, there are certainly FAQs. When I first tried to conceptualize this, I was like, no, I really fight the eccentric. Like, I really slowly lower the load. So that's common thinking, and that's part of the misunderstanding. Anytime you are slowly lowering the load, what you might think of as yielding, because eccentrics are commonly known as yielding reps, you are exerting less force than you do concentrically, and nowhere near the amount of force that you can exert eccentrically on the negative. So again, it's hard to convey the magnitude of impact. We can exert 200% more force right now. Like, you can go to the gym and tap into this right now. We just don't know how. And I mean, even more fundamentally, we didn't know we were capable of this and we weren't doing it. Like I said, I got this wrong too. But what happens when we do tap into eccentric overload training? When we actually try to contract concentrically, but we are overcome eccentrically. It takes some learning to do, because we have taught ourselves to give into the eccentric every single rep we have ever done, but also every step we have ever taken in our lives. We are just used to giving in on the eccentric and really emphasizing the effort on the concentric. That's where the real work has to come in, right? So that's why we tend to think of eccentric as almost a convenient rest between the work of concentrics. So I know it's a mouthful, to say the least, but that's the fundamental concept, which again, I'm putting my reputation on the line. I think this is the biggest training innovation that we've had in decades. And I'm not claiming responsibility for it. I'm just really trying to get the concept out there.
Yeah, no, I think that's awesome, because I think that's still something that is very misunderstood. And, part of that, like you exactly mentioned, is you're sort of working against and with gravity. And because gravity is this like all present thing we've been exposed to 24/7 our entire lives, unless we go to the moon, or I know you've worked at NASA and go into microgravity, it's easy when something is a constant to just forget that it's there, right? Oh, it's just gravity, right? So like you said, by definition, if we're working against gravity, we're pushing something away, we have to exert more load. When we're kind of using gravity, so to speak, we're doing less work. Like, gravity is just taking over. Like, if I throw a ball in the air, once that energy is all dissipated, it just comes back to earth.
Yeah, exactly. So
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, it's one of the challenges is not just understanding that we are missing out on this potential. It's actually executing it.
That was my next question.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, we don't know what it feels like to be overcome by a load, and to fight with everything we have against it and still be overcome by that load. Because if we've ever been in that situation, we've probably been more concerned about our survivability at that point, because it may feel potentially dangerous. But obviously, we want to take steps to get rid of any potential injury risk when we're actually using eccentric overload for training. So this comes back to what I was saying earlier about really getting to know how your muscle contraction feels, really getting your head inside of the muscle contraction. Because if we are just throwing around weights, which everybody does, okay, so not criticism, but if that's our thinking, then we are never going to be able to apply eccentric overload and really get the intended benefit. Because I got to tell you, I've been doing this for years, and I still find myself occasionally during an eccentric overload rep, I will find my mind just, not quite being fully present, and I will be exerting force, like a lot of force on the load, but my head is not in the rep. I am not fully trying to contract concentrically. So yeah, I feel like I'm pushing. I am not trying to contract concentrically and then being overwhelmed. It's a skill, and it's a skill that is counterintuitive, because again, it's not gravity load. We're not giving in. We have again trained ourselves every single rep we have ever done, but it takes some time to develop, and it takes time to develop for every new movement that we do it with. But the gains are worth it. It's definitely the best way. I mean, if I told you you could, instead of using 100 kilos on your bench, if you could use 200 kilos and handle it, you would say, oh yeah, it's probably a better stimulus. If I, fully safe, probably a better stimulus for growth and strength, right? Like I think our instinct carries us that far. So now, you actually have that strength. You have more strength than that. We just have to use it eccentrically. So the ways to do this, again, I go through this in the book, try to kind of walk through, because again, it's a skill. It's not only just a kind of mind-blowing concept, but it's a new skill that we have to learn. But the best ways to do it are going to be, we'll say, trying to eliminate as much gravity load as possible. Now, I know probably the most intuitive exercise we could do for eccentric overload, probably a barbell biceps curl, where you heave the bar up and slowly lower it. Remember, if you're using the correct load and you are really taking advantage of eccentric overload training, you're not slowly lowering a damn thing. Okay, you are fighting with everything you can to get that bar up, but it's just, you can't do it, right? So not necessarily the best exercise. So it's more, how can I say this? I'm aware that we're going to do it. So I want to address that rather than just turning a blind eye and pretending we're not going to do it. So the best ways to mitigate potential injury risk for that one, make sure you do it when you're fresh. So you have your core stability, you have your shoulders active. So everything is ready to fight this negative, even though it's just a biceps exercise. Secondly, rather than looping the bar up like we're trying to do a concentric, treat it more like a clean. So use your hip drive, use your leg drive to quickly get the bar up in a vertical bar path and drive your elbows underneath to catch it. Now,
so do a horrible palms up clean.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Thank you. And lastly, this is a technique, going back to the personalized anatomy, something I call the shoulder lock technique. And it's basically an anatomical arm blaster where you have your arms in front of you for the curl and you dig your arms into your sides. So your arms, once again, stabilized, your shoulders stabilized for the movement. Plus you're digging your arms into your torso. So your core is not going to give up any kind of movement. It is going to stay locked. And by creating as much stability as possible, you are then able to focus on the eccentric overload. You are able to focus on trying to contract concentrically, but being overcome with the negative. How does that one sound so far?
I like that. That's good.
Awesome. Another one, let's jump to the opposite side of the arm, triceps. Great way to do this is elastic resistance. And, maybe familiar with bands and chains, which are commonly known as accommodating resistance. Now, one of the things it's fantastic. It's cool if you've never heard of it before, but I've never seen anyone talk about the different types of accommodating resistance. So in the book, I go through the 3 different types, of which bands and chains are one that is called spatially accommodating. And that means typically the way they're used is that the load tends to increase as you move from the start of the concentric throughout the range of motion to the end of the concentric or peak contraction. The load tends to increase. Okay, that's spatially accommodating resistance. So the way we can employ that is to hang a band from overhead and use 2 hands to stretch it with just a regular triceps push down. This is called the 2 up, 1 down technique, or in this case, 2 down, 1 up technique. But the idea is you're using both limbs on the concentric to get to that exaggerated eccentric portion. So maximal contraction. Then you remove one hand, keep it hovering over the working arm, just as a spot if you need it, and a single limb will perform the eccentric. Okay, so the idea is that you are using a load greater then you could handle with one limb going to full extension, but you can handle the eccentric with one limb. That's the key to eccentric overload. Now, there are two big wins for this. One is that elastic resistance, probably the most common form of resistance that we encounter that is not gravity. So it really helps show us what a non-gravity load feels like, which is huge. And it's surprisingly different. You might get done just a regular warm-up set even and just kind of feel weird in the muscle and in movement because you maybe haven't encountered that type of resistance before. But the other bonus comes back to the great way to introduce eccentric overload training. And that is you want to start by using only the 50% top range of motion. So peak contracted down to 50% of maximal contraction. You do not want to go all the way to a fully lengthened position with your eccentric overload. And the reason is eccentrics can be damaging, which we're actually after a little bit of, right? It's a structural stimulus to build muscle and strength. But we need to be very, very careful about how much damage we're inducing, because the greater the lengthened position under eccentric load, the greater the damage. And right now, if you're not used to handling the eccentric load, which we're not, no one is, and that's such a fantastic opportunity. It's exciting, but you want to be very careful about how you introduce it, whether it's yourself or with a client. From experience, do not make a client too sore. I mean, they are not going to like you if they're limping to the bathroom for the next four days. So start with the top range of motion. And this also comes back to personalization. Get a feel for how your body responds to it, because I can't think of anything else that is what's called more idiosyncratic or individualized in terms of a response. We all respond very, very differently to eccentric contractions and the damage. So there's no one size fits all prescription. Some people get very inflamed and very sore. Some people have to work very hard to get sore. But we can't know until we test it out. So you want to start off, you want to do less than you could just to feel what you experience in the coming days. If you're really sore, then probably a good thing you didn't go too far. But it's better to go lighter than to go too heavy. And the benefit of using bands for this is very organically, they give up a lot of resistance in that fully extended range of motion. So you don't even have to think about only applying maximal force for the peak contraction phase. The bands just do it themselves. So I'm going to take a breath here and
no, that's good. I mean, I think like the 2-1 or 1-2 technique for standard equipment, and if people can just take that principle and wrap their head around it, I think they can get pretty far with that. And I like the partial range of motion too, because everybody's done adding eccentric work in and done a little too much. I did that in college. Like I was like, oh, calf training. So I read this article in maybe it was Muscle and Fitness, I don't remember, and thought, oh, I'll just start doing this. And it was a lot of pauses, eccentric, way more volume than I was used to. And I felt okay walking out of the gym. And then, I was sore for over 2 weeks. Like you forget how much movement of your foot you need to go up and down stairs. And I lived on the 3rd floor downtown at Michigan Tech at that time in Houghton. So like going up the stairs like a penguin with a pole stuck up my ass. And every movement, just walking around, and things you forget too for stability. Like when you squat, your calves are still working. Surprise, they don't turn off. Like even like squatting in the gym was painful. And I'm like, well, why is this? Like, and even bench pressing. I was like, oh, because I have to hold my foot in that position. Like you forget like how often smaller muscles are used until you do something stupid like I did. Or if you've ever been injured.
Yeah, it's that constant reminder, right? It's so if you do this with a client, they are going to have a constant reminder of why they should be pissed off at you. So just be careful of that.
Yeah. Although a pro, if you are a trainer and you can make a female's abs and glutes sore, they'll probably sign up for like 4 years with you. But again,
Nice.
yeah, no, I like that. I've been super fascinated with the kind of the eccentric portion overload, and I guess I keep waiting for this to become more mainstream, and it not really yet. Like I keep thinking like every year, like this is going to be kind of the next big trend, and it just kind of sort of gets there and then disappears. And I think part of it is like you have to do different techniques like you outlined. And there is a place, I think, for some specialty equipment. I don't know if you ever use like an ARX machine or this kind of constant movement. The first time I ever used that was at PaleoFX years ago. And it's this, so imagine if you're just doing like an old school leg press, but imagine that the leg press was on like a pneumatic drive where it's just moving. And then you can put little sensors in it and it can tell you basically how hard you're pushing into the plate. So what's cool about it is that you can specify the rate, and no matter how hard you're pushing, you're still doing things different. But what's great is when they show you the output live, now you have this like additional feedback of exactly what you said. Because man, when you're doing like longer eccentrics like that, it's so hard to sort of stay in the moment. Like every part of your brain and your body just wants to check out of the whole process. But on those machines, if you can see like the feedback, like, oh, yep, you checked out there, like, oh, try to hit this number again. So having that live sort of feedback, I think, is super essential for progress and just motivation doing it. And then there's even newer machines. Like, I don't know if you've seen the new 1080 machine that they have. So 1080 was typically used for sprinting. They had a little tether cord where you could do all sorts of different resisted sprinting moves. But they took the same concept now and they put it into a machine. So I was hanging out with Cal Dietz a couple of weeks ago at University of Minnesota, and they've got two of them. So I got to play around on it. And it's crazy because you can do exactly what you said. I can set how much load I want on it on the way down. And then it'll record how hard I'm pushing against it. So I don't know what they set it. I said, I'll just play around with it. And I don't know what they set it for numbers. But bench press, you could feel on the way up. Okay, that felt heavy. But then on the way down, it's so hard to be working against something that is literally just feeling like it's going to crush you. So they were doing really high percentages of concentric and eccentric and really emphasizing eccentric loads. And he said so far they've seen pretty good results with it too. And then I spread again, you can monitor it. You can see how much force did they put into the bar. So you could do auto-regulatory sets, right? You could say, okay, we're going to go until, 5, 10, 7 sets until we see a 10% drop off or however much drop off we want in performance. We'll quantify that as your, eccentric stimulation for the day. And then, do it again when you come back again. So stuff like that, I think is super cool. The downside is like one of those, like a 1080 machine like that, I think is like 50 grand or something. So pretty expensive, exactly. But super cool stuff.
Absolutely. So I have a common solution that Perfect. I think will help expose people to this type of eccentric overload using what you first described. So the ARX, which is a constant movement machine, is computer controlled, and the resistance moves at a predetermined rate, whether or not somebody's pressing against it or no matter how hard they're pressing against it. And the analogy I use is Star Wars Episode 4, aboard the Death Star, being trapped in the garbage compactor. The garbage compactor walls start to close in on the crew, and it didn't matter how hard they were pushing against the wall. They're not going to be able to resist a garbage compactor, right? It is moving at a predetermined speed, and it's exerting thousands and thousands of pounds of pressure. That is what's called isokinetic resistance. So same movement. And I got confused about this. At first, I used to think, okay, I'm going to do my biceps curl. I'm going to do a very slow movement. I'm going to control the speed. So that's isokinetic, right? No, isokinetic is externally controlled speed. You are not controlling the speed. You are only exerting force against it. It's moving whether or not you're on the machine or not. So weird concept, and especially weird because we have never experienced this before in regular lives, right? Everything is gravity resistance. So when we start to encounter different types of resistance, it starts to feel kind of weird, but also very cool. So I was looking for a way to do this, and pretty much every commercial gym has an isokinetic device, but it's not the way you might think of it. Consider a machine in a commercial gym that is computer controlled. You set it running to a predetermined speed, and it starts moving whether or not you're on it. Think of a treadmill. A treadmill can be an isokinetic device. So the exercise I love using this is called the Barr Fly. And the idea is
I love the name too.
Cheers.
I know which one you're talking about too, so I like the improvement on the name.
It's partially self-deprecating, just humor. But the idea is to perform a negative pec fly, the eccentric of a pec fly. So you are on the side of the treadmill, you kneel over the treadmill, and you press into the belt, starting at maximal, we'll say peak contraction, okay? And as the belt is moving, it is going to push your hand in the eccentric, with the eccentric movement. Your goal, again, is to try to perform a concentric. So your hand starts across your chest, and you will end the rep with your hand on the same side of your chest, just like you performed a regular eccentric, say Dumbbell Pec Fly, which you should never do because it's the worst exercise ever. But the idea is you can exert maximal force throughout the entire range of motion. And this is the second type of accommodating resistance that I call force accommodating, because the belt or the resistance will exert force based on how much force you're exerting. So it's not based on range of motion like it is for spatially accommodating. It is how hard you are pushing that determines the force you're getting back. And I think I'm the first person to come up with this idea that forces can be equal and opposite. I don't know if anyone in physics has come up with that before, but obviously It's one of Newton's law.
Yeah.
So the idea is you want to push as hard as you can, and you are overcome eccentrically.
I like that. I remember you showing that to me at it was an NSCA conference like years ago, and I did it for a while. And don't do like I did and do a lot of volume. That's a bad idea. You'll be like really sore, but it works. It works really well.
Yeah, it's interesting because the research tends to reflect our traditional gravity-based loading and training. So when people do eccentric training, even eccentric overload training, it's still a common set and rep scheme that you might find with just our regular concentric limited reps. So it's definitely an area to improve, area of opportunity. What is a rep? What is a set? How much volume are we doing for eccentric overload? These are all things that need to be figured out, but you typically don't want to do just consecutive repetitions like we do with regular training. Remember, that's going to give you that balance between metabolic fatigue and structural damage versus structural stress. It's a good balance that we're always going to use. But if you are doing forced eccentrics, don't worry about the metabolic stimulus. So do a rep and then pause for a minute, because you are exerting a lot of force, a lot of effort. So take a break, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, it doesn't matter, because the next rep you are going to do needs to be that maximal effort again. So you really need your head in the game. You need, need to mitigate fatigue while you're doing that, because it's not about that metabolic stimulus. Now, the last thing I want to emphasize about this is that, again, fitness industry, hyperbole, nonsense. I mean, barfly is just an idiotic gimmick so I can get my name on exercise.
There you go.
Well, it might be, but consider it's really just tapping into your physiology. And it's not about you hovering over a treadmill and flapping your arm. That's not the point. It's so much bigger than this. It is about understanding these stimuli for muscle adaptation, muscle growth. And how do we get that? Tapping into 200% more force that we have right now, we're just not using. We need to figure out how we can do that to get the biggest bang for our buck. So thinking differently about resistance, thinking differently about things we see in the gym or in everyday life. How can I use XYZ to get some kind of overload, eccentric overload? We need more people doing this. We need more devices available that people can readily use. And my final point, which I love that you brought up the idea that right now eccentric overload, it hasn't been converted to mainstream yet. So we're still in the early adopter phase. Yeah, in 5-10 years, the way it's going, yeah, it'll be pretty common, or at least very well understood. I think the exercise that's going to help change everything is the Nordic leg curl, the eccentric leg curl that is used by so many athletes and so many strength coaches because it is shown to mitigate potential injury risk for athletes who run. So it should be ubiquitous in strength and conditioning for those athletes. But I think it's really going to help usher in an understanding, a greater appreciation of eccentric overload.
Yeah, that's a great one. That's, if anyone's tried doing Nordic curls, they're quite challenging. Even the assisted version. So great exercise for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the conversation used to be like, hey, isn't this dangerous? Like eccentric overload on your hamstrings, that's not good. But even, 5-6 years ago, we had a decent amount of research literature showing that it can actually mitigate potential injury risk. And the research is just now mounting. And there's so much research that it is being evaluated. Studies that did not show a protective effect have been evaluated because the common understanding is, yes, this will work to mitigate injury risk, but there are studies showing it doesn't. Why do they not show that? And it turns out, well, adherence. Athletes weren't actually doing it. So that's how much research we have on this, is not just to evaluate, does it work? It's like, we have so much we can dissect out studies that show it when it doesn't work, and we can figure out why they don't. I mean, that shows a very robust body of literature.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. If you think about just in general what the hamstring is doing, which again is a gross oversimplification, but if we look at the hamstring just across the knee, it's basically one of the main decelerators that's preventing that shear stress in the knee, right? So if your hamstrings are weak as a kitten, your odds of blowing your ACL, in my biased opinion, are going to be much higher. And that may be why we see more in females. Again, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that goes into that with angle to pelvis and potentially hormones, etc. But just all athletic motion has a very high deceleration component, which is primarily more on the eccentric end of the spectrum. And I think, from some of your work and other people, we've gotten a much greater appreciation of that and have started training that more. So hopefully we'll start to see a decrease in kind of non-contact injuries. So
yeah, very well said. Yeah.
Do you like flywheel type training, like the eccentrics? And I know that there's other flywheel based devices coming out in the market. So it seems like there's maybe a more resurgence in that area, which should promote more of a eccentric type emphasis.
All right, so you are exposing a very painful element to my life, so I'm probably going to start crying. Just edit this out. Don't worry about it. Mike, I have never used a flywheel for eccentric overload.
You haven't?
And I am dying to do it. I've been just engrossed in that research for years in writing a separate eccentric book.
Yeah.
And I love it. It is fantastic for eccentric overload. I have all the theory down. I have different ways to do it. But Mike, I've never used it. So please share your experiences.
I think if it's set up correct and it's a good device, I've only used them a handful of times here and there. It's on my list to potentially get it at some point. Like I don't have enough equipment jammed into my garage or metabolic stuff. But it's weird if you've never used it, because when you get the right setting, and for people listening, if they haven't heard of what a flywheel is, it's literally a wheel that spins and creates inertia. So if I'm doing, let's say, a squat and I've got a body harness on, like a belt squat, as I'm coming up, I'm creating more force that's pulling against it. But because that wheel is spinning, I've got like more force that's inertially being driven. It's wanting to pull me down. And so again, you can get on it and do it and just kind of like, fall like a dead fish. And you're like, I don't know why like flywheels are that useful. But if you try to do it and slow down that movement, again, because the load of the force, I know I'm bastardizing these terms for people listening, the physics people are going to lose their mind, but it's just ripping you down. And so to try to counteract that, again, it just feels so different because we're not used to it. But I think especially if you're training athletes, or I think of myself as I'm getting older, what are some of the functions that are easy to lose with just general training? One of them is obviously speed. And I think the other one is higher eccentric type loading, right? You think of injuries. If I get dropped out of the sky from 20 feet in the air kiteboarding, I'm going to have a massive amount of eccentric load that's applied to my body, right? So maybe if I can try to do a little bit more of that loading, maybe I can hedge decrease the risk a little bit. So I think it's useful for that. Obviously, it's good for athletes, deceleration training, that type of thing. But yeah, it's definitely, it feels different. So I would encourage you to give it a whirl whenever you can. I think you would enjoy it.
Give it a whirl. Well
Get it?
done,
Whirl.
sir.
Well
done.
You caught that. Nice job.
I've actually been wanting to talk to you about this for a while, just because of your engineering, not just that education background, but your mindset. So I think, I feel like, maybe a different discussion that we'll have. I think we could go to town on this, but just let me know what you think about this real quick. The best analogy I have heard for a flywheel is it's like a yo-yo. So you throw the yo-yo down, it keeps spinning because you have put energy into the system, just the yo-yo. You put energy into it, and then you just have to flick your wrist, and that energy wants to reverse. So that's how the yo-yo climbs back up the string. So it's unfortunately kind of the opposite in terms of like a flywheel squat. Say you start at the bottom and you squat up, you are putting energy into the system. Like the yo-yo, you have a flywheel underneath that is spinning because you put energy into that. Well, how do you take the energy out? That's where you do the eccentric, and just like the yo-yo reversing to climb up, the flywheel will then, the cord will reverse motion, and you will then take energy out of the system during the eccentric. Now, the trick I heard with this is that when people are used to regular strength training, they will do the concentric just like we would. That's where our effort goes. And because we're used to giving up the eccentric, people just give up the eccentric on flywheel. But guess what? You still have energy that's making that flywheel spin. It's still pulling you down. So you can't just give up and relax on the negative. Otherwise, you're going to be like pulled down further, right? Like you have to exert as much force as you did on the concentric, which already is greater than we do with regular strength training. But it's a conscious effort that needs to be had to make sure you don't fall on your ass, basically.
Yeah. And another version of flywheel training that's a little bit maybe more accessible to people is like the Concept 2 stuff, right? So Concept 2 rower and erg is a flywheel. They have a bike that's a flywheel. They have a ski erg. And it's another way of kind of getting at it. Because if you've ever used a rower before, especially like the Concept 2 ones, you know that you can pull and not create as much force, but there's something about having that average wattage that you're staring at that gives you that immediate feedback, right? So again, your whole point about just trying to mentally stay in the game. If you're rowing a 2000 meter and I want to hit whatever X average, 270 watts, and even if you're pretty well trained, it's so easy to be like, I can just put in a little less effort and I hit like 250, 240. When you're right on that edge of the fastest you want to go, if it's an all-out test, it's a mental battle the entire time to stay with it. Because it's a flywheel, you have to create power each time you pull in order to get the watts to be where you're at. And so it's almost like it's a different thing that you're training your body each time. It's like kind of going on and then a little bit off, on and then a little bit off. Where if you're not doing that, it's just like, say, a bike, it's more of a constant type force the entire time, or running. It's just it's a different feel for sure, especially as you start getting up in higher wattage with it.
It's funny, you just revealed to me that I not only see you as the Metflex guy and the HRV guy, but you are the erg guy to me.
Yeah.
When I think of watts, I think about what you post, like seeing your wattage and your averages and peak. And it's interesting. I didn't actually make that connection until you just said that.
Well, thank you. You can blame my good buddy, Dr. Kenneth J, for that. I got into rowing from him, basically, and the Carrick Institute. And people are like, oh, you must love rowing. I'm like, not really. I don't really like it that much, to be honest. It's a hideous machine. It's horrible, but the transfer is just so high and there's no impact. You're creating power, you're creating speed. The cardiovascular component is very high, but doesn't appear to interfere with weight training because it's a slightly different stimulus unless you get really crazy. And I think there's just something about having that power output that stares you in the face all the time, right? It's like you automatically have a very good quantification across a wide spectrum of biomechanics and abilities that you just can't really run from that. Right. Again, there's some, if you look at elite rowers, they tend to be much taller. They do have different anthropometrics to be an elite rower, but we could put a short person on, we could put a tall person on, and the power they create is a power they're going to create. Right. So for you as an individual, it almost kind of normalizes a lot of other factors. And then being online, I can look at their log and know exactly where they're at. Right. Because in one hand, it's simplistic. Right, you've got your average power that tells you pretty much everything. So the only way to get better is I can move the thing faster, like so frequency, my strokes per minute, or I can create more force per stroke. That's about it. Right? So you're also very fixed on what you can do with it. So
very cool. Yeah, I like that breakdown.
Yeah. Yeah. 2 last questions for you, and we'll let you get back to your normal day. For metabolic stress, do you think hypoxia plays a role in that, or is that kind of like the main principle that's driving everything below it?
That is such an awesome question.
That could be a podcast in and of itself.
Yeah, seriously. Just to, for the sake of maximum fidelity, the idea of metabolic stimulus for hypertrophy, it is still a scientific theory. And there are plenty of studies that show that it doesn't exist. So there's a discussion to be had there. And, as with every other area of this very technical field, Dr. Mike Roberts has a fantastic review specifically on the theory of metabolic induced sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is what it's called.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic, but as with all great science, it raises more questions. So it gives us a nice overview. But in short, I think it's probably a contributor. But Yeah, as far as I know, I don't know. It's actually a very insightful question. Yeah, I'm just sorry I can't offer more.
No, no, it's fine. I love Robert's work. I got to talk to him again at ISSN. I talked to him there maybe for the first time, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. For whatever reason, we were like the only two people at the bar the one night. So I just talked to him for like 3 hours. And if anyone's ever met him, he's one of those guys like, if you meet on the street, he's got this really cool Southern accent, very laid back. You're just kind of like, oh, okay, it's kind of interesting guy. And then you ask him about any molecular stuff, your mind just gets blown. So I had a good talk with him and Lane Norton at ISSN, and I was asking Mike Roberts kind of the same question. I'm like, if this is the mechanism, then for training, would we do this type of thing? And he was super cool. He's just like, I don't know, man. I'm not Louis Simmons. Like, I don't know, like what you would do for training. He's like, I can tell you, we think it's this mechanism and that, but there's this other data that says this, and there's this data that says that, this mouse model, this, that, and so always super fascinating to talk to him too. And it's even more interesting when you get to that level of like how many things we just don't know, right? Like we have data that we think this is what's going on, but I don't know.
And it's muscle growth. Like,
yeah,
there is nothing more accessible to us other than blood. There's nothing more accessible to us than just muscle, and the way that we can influence it, the way we can induce different stresses. And we can study everything, and we have been doing this for decades, and we still don't know what exactly causes muscle growth. And this may not sound like a big deal, which I mean, I'm sure I'm exaggerating, but the idea, it's important because I like to take the Elon Musk first principles approach, and then break everything down through multiple dimensions to its simplest parts and say, okay, what is really going on here? And then we can rebuild that back up into an optimized way, rather than starting off with sets and reps and gravity-based loads, which is, I go through all that in the book and what it actually means. But the idea is, if we had a better understanding of muscle growth, we could start with that basic principle and then design training and stimuli around that. So I've tried to take us as close to that as we could, as I could. But yeah, there's still so much to learn.
Yeah. And the nice part is there's devices on the market. Like I have a Moxie device. It's NIRS, right? So near infrared spectroscopy that you can put over the muscle and determine, how much you're loading on the hemoglobin, myoglobin, how much you're desaturating, you're just stripping oxygen off. But even then, like I could put it on my bicep, but I can get measurements and I can maybe drop my DSAT to 15%, right? Which means I'm creating a sort of semi-hypoxic type environment.
Yeah.
But then how low do I have to go? How long do I have to hold it there? How many sets would I have to hold it there? Even when we have a direct measure, which we can argue about how accurate it is or not, even then, like the parameters we would do is we don't really know. And then if you remove that and you go, oh, wow, like some people might occlude earlier, some people might have different blood flow characteristics depending upon their background, their recruitment, all this other stuff, it gets to be even more messy. So we're back to again, personalization type approach.
Nice. Yeah, I like the way you connected those two, because that's actually how I start off the book, is by introducing those two fundamental concepts, the personalization and what I got reverse engineering, or the first principles approach. So I tried to set the stage, frame out everything I'm going to talk about. So it's not just inane babbling. It's like, oh, there's a method to the madness here. So yeah. Nice connection.
Awesome. Last quick question for you, which again could be a whole podcast on itself. For the purpose of, let's say, arm hypertrophy, are you biased towards internal cues or external cues? So for people listening, an internal cue would be kind of really feel my bicep working. I'm imagining I'm creating tension. It's sort of a feeling based. Or I did a deadlift. I really want you to feel your lats working at lockout or glutes or whatever. Where an external cue would be, here's the thing I want you to accomplish, right? So on a curl, I want you to pull your arm all the way up to your shoulder, or in a press, press your knuckles to the ceiling. It's more of motor programmed of what I want the body to execute.
That I love the not just the question, but your description of it. I think that's fantastic. Insightful as always, Mike, because this is another massive opportunity for improvement. Because the way that we typically train, just instinctively, we are focused externally. Whether or not we know it, we just are. We focus on moving the load. How many times have you performed a hard set and thought at the end, just get the bar up, just get it up, just move the bar? And it kind of feeds into our ego as well, because we can exert more for it. It's a little more efficient to focus on the implement, like the bar. Now, if that's the only way we're training, which is most people, we have a massive opportunity. By focusing on the internal component, focusing on contracting the muscle, going back to the example of concentration curl, the thinking man's curl. Put your head inside the muscle, try to contract the muscle as hard as you can, just like you're posing, okay? Don't worry about the load. The load will move, provided it's light enough. We hope it is. But by focusing on contracting the muscle, you're actually creating more of a metabolic stimulus. It's inefficient, which is why we don't do it, but you are going to get bigger gains, especially if you've never done it before. So I advocate doing both the internal and the external, but most people have never done the internal focused on just contracting the muscle to move the load. It requires a little more effort, a little more awareness of being in the rep. But again, it's a little more, it is more inefficient, which is what we want to get that metabolic stimulus. So if you, you're right, another podcast, but it really helps to emphasize the idea. We are focused on the stimuli for growth. I don't care what your concentric determined load is. Okay, I try to break it down in the book so it becomes clear that, cool, we're training with 80% of our 1RM. That's less than a third of our max force output. So it's cool if you want to focus on adding another 5 pounds and throwing it around. Cool, what are you doing? It's still, a third of what you can really handle. So it's not impressive, So, and I guess I'm speaking to the younger me who is very ego driven, as I'm sure we all are, but trying to focus on the result as opposed to what we look like for a few seconds in the gym, which is not impressive anyway. So sooner we can pull our ego out of it, the better we'll be in terms of getting massive muscular arms.
Yeah. I've gone back and forth on this quite a bit. My bias right now is most everything I do with clients is more external focused. But again, most clients I think are not 100% on hypertrophy. And I'm always thinking about what is the cost to their movement as a human being on top of everything else, because they're not a professional who's getting paid only for hypertrophy.
Yeah.
So to me, then I have to consider the potential risk of injury, movement, what else they're doing in their life. Also, some of the loads they're using, I think, are probably lower than what they could. So I think they're still missing out, like you said, on some of that mechanical tension, just because their strength could be a little bit higher. But again, that's always a trade-off too, right? Like how strong do you have to be before you can get bigger? But what I've noticed in general, even with natural athletes, is the ones who are bigger almost across the board are significantly stronger too. There's outliers to that. Even at a professional level, like you talk to, even people, if they use drugs or not, a lot of times their performance on certain movements was quite good early in their career, and they kind of gravitated more towards exclusively hypertrophy, internal type focused training, and saw much more results from that. So I always wonder then too, if, like you said, they're training the thing that they weren't good at because maybe they were more blessed genetically or whatever on the external cue performance side, but that wasn't their goal. Their goal was to do something else. So they are almost like a hyper responder to the opposite thing. Yeah. So anyway, that's where my brain goes. And I do think that potentially if you're doing a high stability exercise as like a preacher curl, concentration curl, I will agree that maybe an internal cue may be useful there. My general framework, though, is I'll take an external cue, and then once they're done with the exercise, then I'll ask them, what did you feel? So to me, the feeling, the sensation is a byproduct of an external cue. And if I don't get the sensation that I want, I'm going to look at a recruitment pattern, or I'm going to try to take biomechanically and bias that even more in the direction I want. And that generally is by adding, like you said, stability. So it may end up, in order for you to, quote, feel something, you may end up doing a highly braced machine type exercise to know what that sensation then feels like, I guess. I don't know if I'm making any sense at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is gold. Yeah, I love this. That's
because I'm always thinking, like, can I hit kind of the middle of the road? Can I maximize the amount of muscular tension and as a byproduct still get some of the metabolic effects, right? So someone says, hey, I did dumbbell bench presses and all I ever feel is my shoulders hurt. I never feel it in my pecs. I never get a pump. Okay, maybe that's not the best exercise for you. Maybe your recruitment pattern is off. My bias is I'm going to change those things and still use an external cue approach first. And then if we have to get all the way down to doing a seated cable press out first to bias you more on an internal based, highly stabilized exercise, then maybe we'll do that. But in my brain, the goal is eventually I want to get you back to something where you can move a lot of load to get that overall mechanical stimulation. Because to me, I think that's limiting more in people and harder to get than most people. If you give them enough stability and you just really limit the range of motion, they can normally feel a muscle working, but I don't find that the opposite is always true.
Interesting.
Is that kind of what you've seen?
I would say the opposite. I would say that
interesting.
To focus on something that's really inefficient for us, that's almost like fighting instinct, right? Especially when we're in the gym and we're just being, meatheads that, we all are sometimes. We're going to do what is most efficient so we can move the biggest loads, especially because we are so load preoccupied when it comes to progression, for example.
Yes, I agree with that.
So it's external cueing is fantastic for strength. But when I find most people have to be, again, my experience, have to be taught to be inefficient by focusing on the contraction, to squeezing the muscle to perform the movement. But the other benefit that ties back to the eccentric overload, I find that only when people can do both can they really focus on fighting the instinct to just passively resist the eccentric.
Yes.
When they understand both, what it feels like, internal, external, then they can really focus on trying to contract concentrically while being overcome eccentrically. So it's this one more reason I love your insights and experiences. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think for people listening, they might be like, oh, they're saying two completely different things, but I don't think it's really that different, right? So dumbbell bench press, again, like most people, I would cue them and be, okay, you want to accelerate the dumbbell as fast as you can up, but I don't want the dumbbell to fall so fast it's hitting your chest, right? Because everyone's seen those people who go to the gym where you can see someone move a load fast and it can be controlled. And you could see someone move a load fast that looks horrible at the same time, right? And it's just kind of a thing you notice. And so I don't even know if like rep speed is the biggest indication, but ideally I would like someone to move fast or have the intention of moving fast, but yet controlled. And normally when I find that they're able to do that, a side benefit is they can actually afterwards feel the muscle working at the same time. Where if you see people just kind of flopping all around, like, hey, what did you feel after that? I don't know. So, I mean, I think we're probably speaking very very similarly. The thing that I try to get people to avoid is if it's a performance-based movement, I don't want them to be too into their body because I want less sensation, not more. And so I think there's a give and take with that and based on their history, right? Because if you go purely performance, you said, okay, the best deadlift you've ever had in your life, did you have a lot of sensation or very little? Most people are going to be very little, right? Which I think is the goal for pure performance. Now, you could argue if you go pure hypertrophy, we don't care how well you move. We just want the most sensation to activate the most amount of tissue. Again, what is, I think, the cost associated with that? It may be movement quality, potentially pain, and other things. So I think you're always trying to find the spectrum of what's going to be best for that particular athlete who is in front of you.
Yeah, I love the way you say that. And you, real quick, you triggered a quick story that I share in the book with regard to the performance. And what did you feel? There is a powerlifter by the name of Matt Wenning, who multiple world record holder, most muscular hands in the world. Great guy.
His hands are scary.
Yeah, it's impressive. Definitely. I name an exercise after him in the book. But he recounted that the first time he squatted 1,000 pounds, he felt his femurs bow.
Yeah.
The largest and thickest bone in the body. It bowed. And he thought to himself, all right, either I'm going to die a horrible death or I'm going to be 1,000-pound squatter. And he went after it and got it. So it's just a crazy perception. I can't imagine how disconcerting that would feel. I mean, squatting 1,000 pounds alone, but yeah, your femurs bowing and then just pushing through the mindset that takes is incredible.
Yeah. And last thing we'll wrap up is if you can ever find high-speed video film of people doing like breaking boards and cement and stuff, if you can find it, you'll see the bones actually do flex a little bit, which is crazy because the bones actually do have, I wouldn't say a high amount, but they have more elastic properties than what people realize. And that's an issue if you make internal bone fixation because you'll have stress shielding around the spots that you've braced because the material is stronger and tends to be a little bit more brittle. So the bone around it will tend to want to decrease because there's no stress in that area. You've offloaded the stress to a slightly different material. So over the years, they've tried to make like the elasticity and all the other properties, Young's modulus, blah, 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 all this stuff to try to match bone, because if it more similarly matches, you're going to have less stress shielding around it. And again, these are people who tend to not lift and load it and that type of thing. So,
right.
Yeah. So, yeah, I can't imagine doing a load where you feel your femurs like moving. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for all your time. And I know the book is out via Human Kinetics. And where can people find it? And where can they find more about you?
You can go to my website, which is armbar.com.
Nice. I like that.
Barr with 2 R's. Thanks. And my YouTube channel is where I post most of my material. And that is David Armbar on YouTube.
Awesome. And your YouTube stuff is really good. I would highly recommend people check it out. Very entertaining, but also very research-based, very useful stuff, which I think is one thing I enjoy. It's another thing no one really wants to hear like someone reading abstracts. They want to know you put in the time and effort that you've done that, but your videos, you're presenting something that's entertaining and also very useful at the end of the day, which is excellent. And I really enjoyed those.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for all your time today. And thank you for doing the book. And I would highly encourage people go out and get it. Even if arm training is not their number one thing, you can take literally the same principles and apply them to your training. So even if arm training is not your deal, I think you'll still get a lot out of the book too, which makes it even more useful. Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate it.
Cheers. Raise the bar.
That's right. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Again, huge thanks to Dave Barr for coming on, and make sure to pick up a copy of his book. I know how much time and effort he has put into this over years, and you can literally pick it up at a cheap rate. Like, to me, books are crazy cheap for the amount of information that you can get out of them. Anyone who writes a book knows how much time and effort goes in to doing it, especially through a publisher, all the hoops and everything else. And the fact that I can go to whatever my favorite bookseller is, pick up a book very cheap, and get all of that wisdom, to me, is still pretty amazing. So check out his book and all of his information. Big thanks again to Dave for coming on the podcast. Always great to talk to him. And make sure to sign up to the Flex Diet certification. If you want to learn more about nutrition and recovery, we cover everything from protein to sleep to micronutrition, carbohydrates, fasting, a little bit on the ketogenic diet, NEAT. And we also have interviews from 8 expert researchers, everyone from Dr. Stu Phillips, Dr. Jose Antonio, Dr. Eric Helms, Dr. Dan Party, and many more. Go to flexdiet.com, FLEXDIET.com. That's FlexDiet, FLEXDIET.com. There'll be a way to get onto the wait list in the upper right-hand corner. Sign up there. You will be on the free newsletter, and I will notify you the next time that it opens, in addition to getting lots of great information there. So thank you so much. Really appreciate it. As always, if you can subscribe to this podcast through iTunes or your favorite podcast app, that really, really helps us out a lot. With iTunes, the main thing that appears to drive rankings is subscriptions. Always leaving whatever stars you feel is appropriate, and any comments is always greatly appreciated too. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all of it. Talk to you soon.